Hey everybody, and welcome back to my channel. My name is Skylar and I am a certified dog trainer and pet nutritionist. Today I'm going to be talking about the differences between grain inclusive and grain-free pet foods, which one's better, and which one you should be feeding your dog. So to really address this topic, we do need to talk a little bit about dog food history, so bear with me for just a minute. So prior to about the 1960s, dogs were primarily fed table scraps, whatever was left from a hunting trip, garbage, kind of whatever us humans didn't eat. In the 1960s, that's when commercial pet foods and kibbles really hit the market. Between the 20s and the 60s, we did have canned food, and it was, pretty popular. But when Kibble came out, oh my gosh, so many people were getting housed dogs, so many people were getting housed cats. It was a whole big pet industry boom, and tons of people saw this as an opportunity and took advantage of it. Now, what we didn't have in the 1960s was rules and regulations as to what should be in that food. Most of these foods were made up of corn, wheat, and the leftover meats that were not safe for human consumption. It wasn't until the mid-1980s that we actually set nutritional requirements for pet food in order to be complete and balanced, which means that it has all the vitamins and nutrients that they need to survive. This was in part because of a little issue where we accidentally killed a whole bunch of cats. Turns out cats are obligate carnivores, and some of the amino acids and proteins that they need to survive, they don't make themselves. They have to get it from their food. So in the 70s and 80s, a bunch of cats died of dilated cardiomyopathy, which is a heart condition caused by not enough taurine. We had a big whoopsie, we fixed it, and we gave nutritional requirements to all of our dog food manufacturers. First Mate Pet Food in Canada is accredited with the very first grain-free dog food that came out in 1995. I was actually kind of surprised and a little excited to hear that it was First Mate that came out with grain-free food for the first time, just because that is a brand that I'm very familiar with and I do really like their foods. So grain-free pet food came out almost in a necessity because so many dogs were allergic to the chicken, the beef, the corn, and the wheat that were in traditional pet foods. In fact, up until this point, if your dog had allergies, vets recommended that you make lamb and rice and just feed your dog homemade lamb and rice food. While this is a very common combination today, in fact, lamb is now a popular food allergen, lamb was not used in dog food at the time, which made it a novel protein, so there was a very slim chance of your dog having an allergic reaction because of overexposure to this protein. So after grain-free dog food was put on the market, it was mostly independent pet foods and boutique pet foods that created this grain-free food. This was almost a social movement because they were straying away from the really poor quality ingredients associated with the grain-inclusive foods at the time. The words grain-free were heavily associated with better nutrition, more biologically appropriate than the filler ingredients of the counterparts. Grain-free kind of became the term for, I care about what my dog's eating and this is what I'm feeding. Grain-free diets became even more desirable to consumers after in 2007 there was a contamination of melamine in the wheat gluten used in a lot of pet foods. Melamine is a chemical used to make plastics. So naturally this caused a whole bunch of uproar and a lot of concern in the pet food community. So a lot more people, again, to avoid that wheat gluten, went over to grain-free pet foods. Now I can't complete my history of dog food spiel without addressing the DCM claims of the past couple years. I'm not going to go too deep into it because I do want to make a video strictly on DCM and all of the misinformation surrounding it in a future video. But in short, once upon a time, 2 or 3 years ago now, a veterinarian released a study claiming to link peas and legumes found in grain-free dog food with a heart disease, dilated cardiomyopathy, which you might remember when we talked about it and all the cats died. So based on that knowledge, you know that dilated cardiomyopathy, or DCM, is caused by a lack of taurine. This one particular veterinarian study claimed that the peas and legumes inhibited this taurine absorption, thus making grain-inclusive foods optimal for heart health in dogs. In the last couple of years, the FDA has definitely gotten involved and there's been a lot of different studies. The most recent study has been from a whole group of veterinarians that came together And their evidence proves not only is the evidence from the original veterinarian flawed and their data isn't exactly clean and accurate, but they've also shown that there is no direct correlation between grain-free dog foods and this taurine absorption issue that causes DCM. Differing opinions aside, the evidence that we currently have does not show any connection to grain-free diets and DCM, and the FDA actually just recommends continuing to feed whatever food you've been feeding now and not worry about the claims. Now that we have the history out of the way, let's talk about grain-free versus grain-inclusive foods. Now that that's over with, we can move on to grain-free versus grain-inclusive foods. Most of the grain-inclusive foods on the market are most commonly found in grocery store brands. This is because they were much later to the grain-free movement than the independent counterparts, because the ingredients that they're using are pretty cheap and it works with them. They have a large following, so they didn't really feel this need to fill the gap of grain-free diets. That has since changed, and you can now find grain-free and grain-inclusive diets in the grocery store, in PetSmart, in Petco, wherever you buy your foods. But that doesn't necessarily mean that either option is great. Most inexpensive grain-inclusive pet foods use corn or wheat as their main binder ingredients. Now these ones, like I've talked about in other videos, not great ingredients. They have very little to no nutritional value, and they can actually do more harm in the body than good. That doesn't mean though that all grains are bad. For example, Farmina is a really great grain-inclusive brand that are doing it really well. Not only are they not using these filler ingredients, but they primarily use ancestral grains, which are really high in nutrients. On the flip side, a lot of inexpensive grain-free foods will rely heavily on things like pea protein, pea starch, pea flour. This doesn't necessarily mean there's anything wrong with peas, but the way in which they use those peas often add to the overall protein count of the food, which means that they can get away with using less meat. Whereas high-quality grain-free dog foods typically use peas, they also use garbanzo beans, lentils, sweet potato, those kinds of things to help bulk out their foods. So obviously, looking at the ingredient panel is going to be really important in deciphering the quality of your dog food. And as long as it's a good quality food, it's only really up to a couple different variables of which one you should be feeding. Now, like we talked about in the beginning, grain-free dog foods came out of necessity because so many dogs were allergic to the ingredients in their old grain-inclusive food. This can still be the case. So obviously, if your dog has an allergy to specific grains, you're probably going to be more likely to feed a grain-free dog food because obviously you want to avoid those allergens. If your dog doesn't have any allergies, it's completely up to you which one you want to go with. As long as you're feeding a good quality food with great ingredients, really great sourcing, and good company ethics, it's totally up to you whether you feed grain-inclusive or grain-free. Now, why do we even have to have this battle in the first place? Why are there grains in food? Why are there peas and legumes in food? Why isn't it just meat? Why isn't it fine? Kibble was made with us as the consumer in mind and not necessarily the biological needs of the dog or cat that we're feeding. Both dogs and cats really only need a little bit of carbohydrate. For cats, it's typically between 2 and 5% for the primordial diet. For dogs, it's typically between 12 and 15% for the primordial diet. Here, primordial diet means what biologically we think they should be eating. When you think of 2 to 5% and 12 to 15% and compare that to anywhere between 20 and 70% depending on the pet food, and you're gonna get a little bit of an issue there. And that's why I always recommend feeding as little kibble as you're able to and making up the rest of those calories with add-ons, with raw food, with canned food, with meat. Just adding more meat to the diet is gonna help bring that carbohydrate count down and help prevent a lot of the issues associated with a high carbohydrate diet. So why are there carbohydrates in the kibble? Why are there so many? Because kibble needs a binder. The heavy-duty extrusion process involved with making kibble requires that something bind all of the ingredients together to keep that kibble's shape. And these binder ingredients are going to be your peas, your legumes, your sweet potato, your spelt, your oatmeal, your rice, your corn, your wheat. And these ingredients are all important in keeping the kibble together in the kibble shape, as well as bulking out the food. Because obviously if you were to have a whole bag of meat, it's much more expensive than a whole bag of corn with meat. So that's something to keep in mind as well. In general, it's completely up to the consumer whether you want to feed a grain-free or grain-inclusive diet. As long as you're feeding a high quality dog food with, again, good ingredients, good sourcing, good company ethics, then you are completely good to go to make that decision for your dog. If you're unsure if you're feeding a good quality kibble, definitely do some research. If you need help, I'm here to help you. Leave that food down in the comments and I'd love to do a deep dive video. I did do a couple of videos recently, one where I rank a bunch of different pet food brands, and then another one where I do a deep dive on Nutrisource and Pure Vita. I would love to do more deep dives of food because I do think that it's very helpful to get the advice of somebody who works with food pretty much every day and kind of see where things fall there. Overall, I hope that you learned something and any questions that you may have had between grain-free and grain-inclusive foods have been answered. If you have any other suggestions for future videos, leave those down in the comments, and until next time, bye!